The evening sun sank low behind the red cliffs, setting the sky on fire with hues of amber and rust. The wind carried a faint chill through the canyon, whispering through the cottonwoods that lined the narrow creek. Out there, where the earth met the heavens and silence spoke louder than words, a man stood watching the horizon with a worn heart and tired eyes. His hands, scarred from years of labor, rested on the haft of his axe. Behind him, smoke rose gently from a small fire where two little boys sat waiting for supper. Their laughter was quiet but pure, the kind that could momentarily chase away the weight of a man's sorrow. He was an Apache, though time and circumstance had pushed him far from the wild pride of his people. The world had changed, and he had learned to bend with it. He worked for a rancher now, cutting wood and tending horses in exchange for shelter. But behind that quiet existence was a past heavy with loss. The war had taken much from him: his wife, his village, his sense of belonging. All that remained were his sons, and the promise he made to their mother: to keep them safe, no matter how cruel the world became. Across the ridge, on the edge of the valley, an old wagon creaked into view. Its wheels struggled against the rocky trail, and from its seat, a woman guided the mule with hands trembling more from exhaustion than fear. She had come far, too far perhaps for someone carrying so much grief. She was a widow, newly arrived from the east, seeking quiet in a land that knew little of it. The war had taken her husband, disease had claimed her child, and loneliness had become her shadow. The small cabin she purchased with her remaining savings stood near the Apache man's clearing, just beyond the creek, a place where the wind never stopped speaking. When he first saw her, she was trying to lift a broken wheel from the mud. Her bonnet hung loose and her dress, torn from travel, told of sleepless nights and silent prayers. He didn't say a word. He simply walked over, lifted the wheel free, and nodded once before walking away. She wanted to thank him but couldn't find her voice. There was something in his eyes, a quiet depth, an unspoken pain, that both unsettled and drew her in. She would see him again and again in the days that followed, cutting wood at dawn, guiding his boys by the river, always alone, always watching the mountains as though waiting for someone who would never return. The widow had planned to keep to herself. Her days were meant to be filled with work, not conversation. But the silence around her cabin began to grow unbearable. Each night the coyotes sang their sorrow, and the wind pressed through the cracks in the walls like a ghost whispering memories she wanted to forget. One afternoon, when the rain had turned the ground to clay and her firewood was soaked through, she found herself knocking on his door. He opened it slowly, his boys peeking from behind his legs, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. She stood there, drenched and trembling, asking if she could borrow a bit of dry wood. He handed her a few pieces without a word, but before she could leave, one of the boys offered her a small wooden carving, a bird rough yet delicate. "He made it," the boy said proudly, pointing to his father. The woman smiled faintly, holding it close like it meant more than it should have. That was the beginning. Small, hesitant moments shared between two broken souls who didn't yet realize how much they needed each other. Days turned to weeks. The widow would often see him repairing fences or tending to the fire while his boys played nearby. Sometimes she brought bread, other times soup, always leaving it quietly by the door. He never refused it, though he rarely spoke. The land around them seemed to breathe with a kind of understanding, as though it knew that healing often began in silence. But one night, something changed. A storm swept through the valley, fierce and sudden. The wind roared across the plains, tearing at roofs and fences. When the widow's lantern blew out, she rushed outside to secure her door, only to hear the frightened cry of one of his boys echoing through the darkness. Without thinking, she ran across the muddy clearing toward their cabin. The river beside the path had risen fast, its current wild and loud. She found the father knee-deep in the torrent, holding his youngest child tightly while the older one clung to a branch on the bank. Without a word, she waded in beside him, gripping his arm as they fought to pull the boy free. Together they made it out, gasping and soaked, the storm howling around them. For the first time, their eyes met not as strangers but as two people bound by something deeper than circumstance. He thanked her quietly, his voice rough, almost broken. The next morning the sky cleared, leaving behind a world washed clean. The widow found herself sitting outside her cabin, the wooden bird still on her table. She looked toward his home and saw smoke rising, steady and warm. Something inside her shifted, a fragile thread of connection she didn't know she had been waiting for. As the days passed, she began spending more time near the creek, helping his boys gather wild berries or teaching them to read from an old book she carried. He would watch from a distance, his guarded expression slowly softening. There were moments when he wanted to speak, to tell her what it meant to see kindness return to his children's lives. But the words stayed locked behind his silence. Still, every glance, every small gesture, began to say more than either of them dared to admit. The town nearby noticed too. Whispers traveled fast in those parts, and not everyone took kindly to the sight of a white widow and an Apache man growing close. Some called her foolish, others warned her to stay away. Yet she found herself drawn to his quiet strength, to the way he treated his sons with gentleness rare among men hardened by loss. She began to understand that sometimes the heart chose without permission, and the cost of denying it was heavier than any gossip. But the world they lived in had sharp edges. One evening, as the sun burned low and the shadows stretched long, a group of men rode out from town, their voices drunk with anger. The widow, hearing the horses, stepped out of her cabin just as the riders stopped by the creek. The Apache stood before his door, his boys hiding behind him. Words were shouted, ugly, cruel words that turned the air cold. The men warned him to leave, saying this land wasn't meant for his kind. She wanted to speak, to defend him, but fear froze her tongue. He said nothing, his jaw set, his eyes steady. When the riders left, the silence that followed was heavier than any thunder. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the look on his face, quiet resignation mixed with the kind of sorrow that comes from years of carrying more than one man should. Before dawn, she lit her lamp and walked toward his cabin. He was already outside, packing his few belongings. His son stood nearby, sleepy and confused. When she reached him, he looked up once and she felt her heart twist. She wanted to tell him not to go, that the town didn't matter, that she needed him here. But before she could speak, he whispered, "Please don't leave." For a moment she didn't understand, until she saw the tremor in his hands, the plea in his eyes. He wasn't the one leaving. He was asking her to stay. The wind caught her breath as the first light touched the horizon. Tears she had buried for years rose like a flood she could no longer stop. And in that quiet, sacred moment between two wounded hearts, the widow finally cried in his arms. But far down the trail, the echo of hoofbeats was returning, carrying with it a danger neither of them saw coming. The morning after the storm of fear and tears, the valley seemed strangely quiet. The widow stood near the doorway of the Apache's small cabin, the scent of damp earth rising around her. His sons were asleep inside, curled under a rough wool blanket. The father sat on a fallen log by the fire, sharpening his knife in slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of steel against stone echoed faintly, blending with the soft rustle of the wind. She wanted to speak, to ask what he meant by those words. "Please don't leave." But something about his stillness made her pause. There was a calm about him that came not from peace, but from exhaustion deeper than any wound. When he finally looked up, his eyes were softer, yet shadowed by something unspoken. "They won't stop," he said quietly. His voice was low and rough like gravel beneath water. "Those men from town, they think fear will drive us away." He looked toward the creek where the sun glinted off the muddy water. "They forget this land remembers who it belonged to before their fathers came." She stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "You shouldn't have to leave," she whispered. "You've done nothing wrong." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more sadness than comfort. "Doing nothing has never been enough," he said. "Not for my people, not for a man like me." The words struck her heart. She had known injustice in her own way, though it had never worn the same face. When her husband had gone to war, people had called her brave. When he died, those same people called her cursed. She had come west to escape their pity, thinking the land would give her peace. But now she saw that this place too had its ghosts, its own quiet wars fought between skin and soil, between the past and whatever hope dared to survive it. Over the next days, life resumed its slow rhythm. The widow helped the boys mend their fishing lines and taught them small lessons from her books. The Apache worked long hours in the hills, cutting wood for the ranchers who still paid him, though their glances had grown colder. At night, when the wind moved through the trees, she could hear the coyotes calling, their cries rising like unanswered prayers. She often wondered if the land was warning them or mourning with them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mesa, she found him sitting by the riverbank. He held a small piece of leather in his hands, worn smooth from years of touch. It looked like a piece of jewelry, a charm of some kind. "It was hers," he said softly when he saw her eyes linger on it. "My wife. She made it from the sinew of a deer she hunted herself." The widow knelt beside him, her heart heavy. "Do your boys remember her?" He nodded slowly. The little one dreams of her. Sometimes he wakes calling her name. His eyes clouded and he took a deep breath. They were very young when it happened. Soldiers came to our camp, said they were looking for stolen horses. She stood between them and my children. They shot her. His voice broke slightly, though he didn't look away from the river. After that, I brought them here, far from everything that burned. She listened in silence, unable to find words large enough to carry the weight of his memory. The fireflies began to appear, dancing above the water like small floating embers. For the first time, she reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. The days that followed carried a strange peace, fragile and warm. But beneath it, both knew danger hadn't passed. The men from town had been seen again, talking loudly in the saloon, their pride stung by the Apache's refusal to leave. Word spread that someone planned to teach him a lesson. The widow heard whispers when she went to trade at the store. Some warned her gently, others sneered. "You're living too close to trouble," one woman said as she wrapped a loaf of bread. "Best stay out of it. Those people don't change." That night she couldn't sleep. The wind was restless, slapping the shutters and stirring the dry grass outside. She rose from bed and lit her lantern, its glow faint against the darkness. Through the window she saw movement near the creek, a flicker of light, then another. Her pulse quickened. She stepped outside, clutching her shawl tight. Down by the trees, two men on horseback lingered in the shadows, their voices low but sharp. She could only make out a few words, but one chilled her to the bone. Tomorrow night. The next morning she went to his cabin, pretending calm. His boys were outside playing with a wooden hoop, laughter cutting through the heavy air. When he came out, she told him what she'd seen. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. "I knew it would come," he said. "It always does." He looked at the hills, the way one looks at something both beautiful and cruel. "I will not run again. My sons deserve to stand where their mother once stood." She felt her heart twist in fear. "Then let me help," she said. He shook his head. "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is," she answered firmly. "They'll come for both of us." I saw how they looked at me too. For a long moment he said nothing. The air between them was filled with the quiet roar of the river. Finally he nodded once, slow and heavy. "If they come," he said, "we will stand together." Through that long day, a silence settled over the valley. Even the birds seemed to sing softer, as if sensing the tension that hung like a storm above them. The widow helped gather supplies, her hands shaking as she packed dried meat and water into small sacks. She wasn't sure what she was preparing for, flight or fight, but the act gave her purpose. The Apache cleaned his rifle, then showed her how to use it, though she prayed she'd never have to. As dusk came, he took his sons to the creek and spoke to them softly in his language, words she didn't understand but felt in her chest like the beating of a drum. The boys listened, solemn and quiet, before running to hug their father. Watching them, the widow felt her throat tighten. She had once dreamed of a family like that, simple and whole. Now, standing in the fading light, she realized that what bound them all wasn't blood but loss, and the courage to face whatever came next. Night fell heavy. The moon was hidden behind clouds and the air smelled of rain. They sat together by the fire, the children asleep inside. She could hear the faint crackle of wood and the distant howl of wolves. "Do you believe they'll really come?" she asked softly. He stared into the flames. "Yes," she hesitated. "Then why stay?" He turned to her, his gaze steady. "Because running teaches them they were right to chase us." His words settled deep in her mind, stirring something she hadn't felt in years. A quiet strength, born from shared pain. She wanted to say something back, something to give him hope, but before she could, a sound broke the stillness. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, coming down the trail from the ridge. He rose instantly, motioning for her to stay quiet. The firelight caught the sharpness in his eyes. He moved to the doorway, listening. The sound grew louder, closer. She could see faint lantern light through the trees. 2, maybe 3 riders. Her heart pounded so hard she thought the sound might give them away. He turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay inside with the boys." She shook her head. "No." The look he gave her was part warning, part something else, something that spoke of trust. Then, before either could speak again, the horses stopped. A man's voice called out, cold and familiar. "We just came to talk, Redskin." The widow's stomach turned. It was one of the men from the saloon, the one who had shouted the loudest that night by the creek. The Apache stepped into the open, the moon breaking through the clouds just enough to cast his face in pale light. "You've done enough talking," he said. There was a pause, then the metallic click of a rifle. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the man said. The widow could barely breathe. The boys stirred in their sleep as thunder rumbled far away. She gripped the wooden table, praying it was only a threat, but deep down she knew it wasn't. The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain and fear. The Apache's voice came again, calm and steady. "Leave my land and you can ride home safe. Stay, and you'll answer to the same earth that raised me." The men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Then came another sound, a gun cocking. The widow ran to the door just as lightning flashed across the sky, turning everything white for a heartbeat. In that light, she saw him standing tall against 3 armed riders, unflinching, his shadow stretching across the wet ground like a mark of defiance. Then darkness swallowed the valley again, and the first shot rang out. The gunshot shattered the quiet night, echoing through the canyon like thunder rolling through hollow bones. The horses reared, and one of the men cursed as his rifle went off again, sending sparks from a rock near the creek. The widow screamed without meaning to, her voice lost in the wind. The Apache dropped to one knee, returning fire with a single, precise shot. One of the riders fell hard, his lantern crashing to the ground and bursting into a flicker of flame that lit the wild grass. The light spread across the mud and smoke, painting the scene in chaos and shadow. The widow rushed outside despite his warning. The wind tore at her hair as she grabbed the fallen lantern and stomped out the fire before it could spread. Her breath came fast, the air thick with smoke and rain. She saw him standing tall again, his rifle raised, his sons crying from the doorway behind her. The 2 remaining riders had retreated a short distance, shouting threats they didn't seem brave enough to carry through. The rain came harder, soaking everything, washing blood and ash into the dirt. When the last echo faded, the night fell eerily still again. The Apache stood in silence, his chest heaving as he lowered his rifle. The widow turned toward the fallen man, his hat gone, his face pale in the flickering light. She'd seen him before in town, loud and cruel, the kind who picked fights to prove his worth. Now he was just still. The Apache knelt beside him briefly, then looked up at her. "He's gone," he said quietly. There was no pride in his tone, only a heavy sadness. "The others will come back with more." The widow shivered, her dress clinging to her from the rain. "Then we have to go," she whispered. He shook his head. "Not yet. If we run now, they'll follow. We'll leave when the boys can travel before the sun sets again." His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil within. He was a man who had seen this pattern before. Violence met with vengeance, and vengeance never ending. As dawn broke, they buried the man near the edge of the creek. It wasn't out of kindness, it was out of necessity. Leaving a body unburied in the open would bring attention too soon. The boys helped carry rocks, their small hands trembling, but determined. The widow couldn't stop shaking either, though she tried to hide it. When the grave was covered, the Apache stood for a long time, looking at it without expression. Then he turned to her. "You shouldn't have come outside last night," he said. She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "I wasn't going to let you fight alone." For a moment he said nothing. Then his face softened, and he looked away toward the horizon. "No one's ever said that to me before." The wind carried the smell of wet sagebrush through the clearing. The world looked the same as it had yesterday, but everything had changed. In town, word of the gunfight spread fast. Some said the Apache ambushed the riders, others said it was self-defense. Either way, anger grew like dry grass before a fire. Men gathered at the saloon, their talk turning dark. A ranch hand named Carter, who had once worked alongside the Apache, slammed his fist on the bar. "He's a danger," he said. "You let one of them get away with killing a white man, and soon they'll all think they can." Another voice cut through the room, quieter but colder. "That widow's got herself mixed in it too. Maybe she's hiding him." The sheriff, an old man with weary eyes, said nothing for a long time. He'd seen enough killing in his life to know it never stayed simple. "Leave it alone," he said finally. "Let it cool down. We'll go out there and talk when the time's right." But no one really listened. Back in the valley, the widow tried to prepare for the journey he promised they would take. She packed food, blankets, and the wooden bird the boy had given her. Yet she couldn't shake the unease pressing against her chest. The Apache was restless, moving from one task to another, fixing the wagon, sharpening tools, checking his rifle. She could tell he was keeping his hands busy to keep his mind from breaking. As the day wore on, clouds gathered again over the cliffs, dark and heavy. The boys stayed close, sensing something dangerous in the air. The older one asked quietly, "Are they coming back?" His father paused before answering. "They might," he said, "but we'll be ready." The widow knelt beside the boy. "You have brave blood," she said softly. "Don't forget that." By late afternoon, the sky turned a strange yellow-gray, and thunder began to rumble. The Apache told her to stay inside with the boys while he checked the ridge for movement. She watched him go, his figure blending with the brush and stone until he vanished into the storm. Time passed slowly. The wind rattled the windows, and the rain came again, beating against the roof like impatient fists. She held the boys close, whispering that everything would be all right, though she didn't believe it herself. When the door creaked open suddenly, her heart leapt. But it was only him, dripping wet, his expression grim. "They're coming," he said simply. She froze. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. On horseback. They'll reach the creek before dark." Her hands tightened around the lantern. "Then we have to go now." He shook his head. "If we move in the open, they'll see us. We wait until nightfall. The storm will hide our tracks." He crouched by the table, spreading a rough map he'd drawn into the dirt. "We'll head south through the ravine. It's narrow, but they can't follow with horses. There's a cave near the cliffs. We'll stay there till morning." The plan sounded desperate, but it was all they had. The widow nodded, forcing herself to be brave for the boys. As she helped gather supplies, she noticed his hands trembling slightly. He tried to hide it, but she saw it anyway. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for them. By the time the sun began to fade, the riders were close enough that their voices could be heard faintly over the rain. The widow peeked through the crack in the shutter and saw their torches flickering through the trees. Her stomach twisted. One of the riders carried a rope. Another had a rifle slung across his chest. The Apache stood by the doorway, silent and still, his weapon ready. The boys huddled behind their father, their small faces pale. The widow's heart pounded as the sound of hooves drew nearer. The men stopped just across the creek. She could hear them talking, their words carried faintly through the storm. "Sheriff says wait till morning," one of them said. Another voice answered, "Sheriff ain't here." The Apache looked at her, his eyes dark and calm. "When I tell you, take the boys and run," he said. She shook her head fiercely. "I won't leave you." He gave her a look that stopped her breath, a mix of pleading and command. "Promise me," he said. "They need you." Lightning flashed again and thunder shook the valley. The men began to move forward, their torches bobbing through the rain. One shouted, "Come out, Apache! Make it easy on yourself." The widow clutched the younger boy's hand, whispering prayers she barely remembered. The older boy clung to his father's sleeve, refusing to let go. Then, as the riders reached the edge of the creek, the Apache raised his rifle and fired. The torch nearest the front burst apart, plunging the men into darkness. Horses screamed and chaos erupted once more. "Now!" he shouted. The widow grabbed the boys and ran toward the ravine, her feet slipping on the wet ground. The storm swallowed every sound but the pounding of her heart. Behind her, more shots echoed, flashes of light cutting through the night. She wanted to look back, but she couldn't. The boys stumbled beside her, their hands tight around hers. When they reached the ravine, she turned just enough to see the faint glow of fire behind them. The cabin was burning. For a moment, she stopped, breathless, the rain streaking her face. Somewhere beyond the flames, she heard the crack of another gunshot, and then silence. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the cry rising in her throat. The boys clung to her, terrified. The oldest whispered, "Papa?" She couldn't answer. The storm raged above them, and the fire burned bright against the dark hills. She forced herself to move again, guiding the children deeper into the ravine, away from the light, away from the sound of what they had lost or what they might still lose. Far behind them, through the sheets of rain and smoke, a figure moved near the flames. The Apache stumbled through the mud, clutching his side, blood mixing with the water. His rifle hung loose in his hand, but his eyes were fixed on the dark trail leading south. He could barely see, but he followed anyway. He had made a promise to protect his sons, no matter the cost, and not even death would turn him from it. The night swallowed him whole, the fire fading behind him as the rain poured harder, washing the footprints of all who had run. The wind carried nothing but the sound of the storm, and somewhere deep in the ravine, the widow and his children waited, unaware that the man they feared dead was still fighting his way toward them, every step between life and loss hanging in the balance. The rain finally began to ease by morning, leaving the ravine soaked and heavy with mist. The widow crouched near the cave entrance, her arms wrapped around the boys as they slept, their small bodies trembling in the cold. Her dress was torn, her hands raw from climbing over rocks through the storm. The world outside was gray and silent, but her heart beat fast with dread. Every sound, the dripping of water, the groan of wind through stone, felt like footsteps approaching. She hadn't seen him since the night before, since the fire. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of gunfire and the glow of the cabin burning against the rain. She wanted to believe he was alive, but fear whispered otherwise. She stirred when the older boy moved beside her. He looked at her with wide, tired eyes. "He'll come," he said softly, as if reading her thoughts. She nodded, though her throat ached too much to answer. The boy looked so much like his father, steady, calm even in fear, that it almost broke her. She wanted to protect them, but she didn't know from what anymore, the men, the storm, or the grief that hung in the air like smoke. The sun tried to break through the clouds, painting the cliffs with faint gold. The widow stepped out carefully, scanning the valley. The cabin's ruins were barely visible through the haze, a thin curl of smoke still rising from where the fire had eaten the roof. No movement, no sound of horses. She should have felt safe, but the silence only deepened her unease. She turned back toward the cave and whispered to the boys, "Stay here. I'll go a little way just to see." They begged her not to, but she needed to know. Taking a small pistol she'd carried from her wagon, she moved slowly through the wet brush. Her shoes sank into the mud, her skirt catching on thorns. Every few steps she stopped to listen. Somewhere far off a raven cried, a harsh, lonely sound that sent a chill up her spine. She kept moving until she reached the bend overlooking the creek. What she saw froze her in place. A trail of footprints led from the burned cabin down toward the trees, heavy, uneven prints half washed by the rain. She knelt beside them and saw blood mixed with the mud. Her chest tightened, but she followed, each step slower than the last. The prints stopped near a fallen log, where something dark lay tangled among the weeds. For a moment she thought it was only a coat. Then she saw the motion, a faint rise and fall of breath. It was him. She dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she turned him gently. His skin was cold, his shirt torn and soaked in blood from a wound near his ribs, but his eyes opened when she touched him. He looked up at her, his voice a rasp. "You made it," he whispered. Tears blurred her vision. "Don't try to talk," she said. "I'll get you to the cave." "The boys are waiting." He tried to sit up, grimacing in pain. "Are they safe?" "Yes," she said quickly, "but we have to move." "The men might come back." He nodded weakly. Together she helped him to his feet, wrapping his arm over her shoulder. Every step was agony for him, but he didn't stop. The widow's heart pounded with fear and determination. She could feel the warmth of his blood soaking into her sleeve, but she didn't care. She just kept whispering. Almost there, just a little more. When they reached the cave, the boys ran to him, crying out in relief. He managed a faint smile, resting his hand on their heads before collapsing near the fire pit. The widow tore strips from her dress to bind his wound, pressing down until the bleeding slowed. His breathing was shallow but steady. She stayed awake the entire day, tending the fire, watching the trail below. The rain stopped completely by afternoon, leaving behind a damp stillness that made every sound seem louder. She heard distant thunder again, though the sky was clear. The boys gathered around their father, whispering softly in their language. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling. They were promising not to be afraid. When evening came, he opened his eyes again. "They'll come for me," he said. His voice was stronger now, though his face was pale. "They'll want revenge for the man who died." She shook her head. "Then they'll have to get through me first." He tried to smile, but pain cut him short. "You shouldn't stay. Take the boys and go east. There's a trading post 2 days' ride from here. Tell them your name. They'll help." She looked at him fiercely. "I told you before, I won't leave you." He reached for her hand, his grip weak but warm. "You've already lost too much," he said softly. Don't lose them too. Her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't speak. The wind picked up again outside, carrying the faint scent of smoke. She froze, turning toward the cave entrance. Through the trees, she saw it, a thin column of gray rising against the fading sky. Someone had lit a fire nearby. He saw it too. They've found the trail. She stood quickly, grabbing the pistol and the rifle he'd brought. Then we move now. He tried to stand, but pain dropped him back down. I can't, she looked at him, trembling. Then we'll hide you. They won't find this place if I lead them away. His eyes widened. No, if they see you, they'll... I'm not afraid, she said firmly. I won't let them hurt you or your sons. Before he could stop her, she kissed his forehead, her tears falling on his skin. Then she turned and ran toward the narrow path down the ravine. The boys called after her, but she didn't look back. Every instinct screamed at her to run the other way, but she kept going toward the smoke. As she neared the clearing, she could hear voices, men talking, their tones sharp and restless. She recognized one from the saloon, the one who'd threatened the Apache before. He's here somewhere, he was saying. Find him, or burn what's left of this valley. She crouched behind a tree, her pulse racing. She could see 3 of them now, searching the brush, rifles slung across their backs. Their horses snorted, uneasy in the damp air. She knew she couldn't fight them all, but if she could distract them, give the Apache time to move with the boys, maybe they'd survive. She picked up a small stone and threw it across the clearing. It hit a bush on the far side, making a sharp crack. The men spun around instantly. Over there! One shouted, running toward the sound. She waited until they were far enough, then rose from the shadows and ran in the opposite direction. Branches tore at her arms as she pushed through the brush, the sound of boots and shouts echoing behind her. A shot rang out, then another. She ducked low, heart pounding, and stumbled over a fallen log. Mud splashed up her skirt as she crawled through the undergrowth, her breath ragged. Behind her, one of the men cursed. She's heading south! After her! She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs trembled beneath her. She could hear the river ahead, its rushing sound growing louder. She slipped down the bank, landing hard on her knees, the pistol clutched tight. For a moment, she thought she'd lost them. Then she heard footsteps again. She turned toward the water and saw their reflections in the current, 3 figures closing in. Her hands shook as she raised the pistol. One of them laughed. Put it down, Missy. We just want to talk, she aimed higher. Stay back, the man took another step. You're far from town. Ain't no one coming to save you, the widow fired. The shot went wide, hitting a rock near his feet, but it was enough to make him flinch. She turned and ran again, following the river upstream. The path narrowed, bordered by jagged rocks and slippery moss. Behind her, the men shouted, their voices fading and rising again as the terrain turned rough. Back in the cave, the Apache forced himself to his feet. The wound tore with every breath, but the thought of her out there alone was worse than the pain. He grabbed his rifle and stumbled toward the mouth of the ravine. The boys tried to follow, but he turned to them sharply. Stay. No matter what happens, stay hidden. He moved through the mist, following the faint echo of gunfire. The land seemed endless, the sound of the river guiding him forward. His vision blurred, but he kept walking, driven by something beyond will, by the memory of her standing in the rain, refusing to leave him behind. The widow, meanwhile, had reached a narrow ledge above the river. Her dress was torn, her pistol empty. The men were close behind, their boots crunching on the wet stone. She looked down at the water rushing below, a deadly drop, but her only escape. Before she could decide, a voice echoed through the canyon, sharp and familiar. Enough! The men stopped. From the shadows, the Apache emerged, his rifle raised despite his trembling hands. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with fury. The widow gasped, torn between relief and terror. The men hesitated, recognizing him, and realizing that the wounded man they thought dead had returned to stand between them and their prey. Rain began to fall again, thin and cold. The sound of the river roared louder beneath them. The Apache took one step forward, steadying his aim. The widow could feel her heart pounding, the world holding its breath. The leader of the riders sneered. You should have stayed down, Indian. Lightning flashed, turning the canyon white. In that frozen instant, the widow saw the Apache's finger tighten on the trigger, the men raising their weapons in answer, the storm howling through the cliffs. Then the world erupted in sound and light as the first shot of the final battle rang out. The gunfire cracked like thunder across the canyon, echoing against the wet stone walls. Smoke rose from the rifles, mingling with the mist as the sound rolled away into the valley. The widow dropped to the ground, her hands over her ears, feeling the vibration of every shot in her chest. The Apache stood firm, bracing himself despite the pain tearing through his side. He fired once, and one of the riders fell, tumbling into the river below. The others hesitated, their faces pale in the flash of lightning. Rain poured harder now, turning the ledge slick beneath their boots. One of the men took aim, shouting something lost to the roar of the storm. The Apache returned fire, his shot grazing the man's shoulder and spinning him back. The widow crawled toward him, shouting his name, but he didn't look back. His entire focus was on protecting her and his sons waiting in the cave. The leader of the riders, a tall man with a scar across his jaw, stepped forward with cold fury in his eyes. "You can't win," he yelled over the storm. "You're alone, and this land doesn't belong to you." The Apache's voice came steady, low, and filled with something deeper than anger. "This land belonged to my father and his father before him. You're the ones who don't belong." The man lifted his rifle, but before he could fire, the widow seized a fallen weapon from the ground. Her hands trembled, but she raised it and shouted, "Enough!" Her voice cut through the storm like a crack in the sky. "No more killing!" For a moment, no one moved. The rain hissed between them, falling in sheets. The Apache took that moment to aim one last time. The shot rang out, striking the man's rifle and sending it spinning into the mud. The leader stumbled back, stunned. Silence followed, broken only by the pounding rain. The remaining riders, shaken and soaked, exchanged looks before turning their horses toward the ridge. They didn't speak a word as they disappeared into the mist, their anger drowned by the storm. When the last echo faded, the widow dropped the rifle and rushed to the Apache. His face was pale, his strength nearly gone. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed against his wound. "You're bleeding again," she whispered. He smiled faintly, the corners of his lips barely moving. "It's over," he said softly. "You and the boys are safe." Tears filled her eyes as she held his face in her hands. "You saved us. You saved all of us." He reached up weakly, his fingers brushing the tears from her cheek. "You gave me something to fight for again." His voice was barely more than a whisper now, carried away by the wind. "Promise me you'll take care of them." She nodded quickly. "I will, but you're coming with us. You hear me? You're not leaving us now." He didn't answer, but his eyes held hers with quiet warmth, the kind that carried more love than words could. The rain eased at last, the storm fading into distant thunder. She pressed her forehead against his, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since her husband's death, asking for one more chance, one more breath. They stayed that way for a long time, the sound of the river below a steady rhythm beneath the fading storm. Eventually she felt his breathing steady, weak but still there. Relief swept through her so deeply it made her dizzy. With great effort she helped him to his feet. Together, they began the slow walk back toward the ravine. By the time they reached the cave, the clouds had broken apart, and sunlight poured through, golden and warm after the long, dark night. The boys ran out as soon as they saw them, their faces lighting up with joy. The younger one threw his arms around his father, who knelt and held them both close, his eyes closed in silent gratitude. The widow built a small fire outside the cave, drying their soaked clothes and heating water for his wound. She worked quietly, her movements calm but sure. The Apache sat nearby, watching his sons play with the wooden bird she still carried. It had somehow survived everything, fire, storm, and flight. He smiled faintly when he saw it. "She made it," he said, his voice stronger now. "Yes," the widow replied softly. "She's tougher than she looks." For the first time, laughter returned to their small circle, fragile but real. The boys told stories in both English and Apache, their words mixing together like two streams meeting in one river. The widow listened, her heart finally beginning to feel light again. They stayed hidden in the ravine for 2 more days, resting and gathering strength. When the sheriff finally rode out to the valley, he found only the burned remains of the cabin and the body of one rider the others had abandoned. He followed the track south but stopped when he saw where the storm had washed them away. He took off his hat, sighed, and said to no one in particular, "Let the land settle it. Some things don't need more blood." Farther south, in the quiet shade of the canyon, the small family prepared to leave. The Apache had recovered enough to walk without help, though the wound still slowed him. The widow had gathered what few things they had left, the pistol, the wooden bird, and a bundle of dried meat. The boys loaded the mule and clung to each other, unwilling to be apart even for a moment. Before they left, the widow looked back at the hills. Smoke no longer rose from the ruins. The grass was already beginning to grow again where the fire had burned, small green shoots pushing through the black soil. Life had returned, quiet and patient. She turned to him. "Where will we go?" He looked toward the horizon, where the land stretched wide and free beneath the morning sun. "There's a place west of here," he said. "A valley with good soil and clear water. No one owns it yet." She smiled softly. "Then it's ours." He glanced at her, his dark eyes steady. "If you still want to stay." Her answer came without hesitation. "I told you once, I'm not leaving." For a moment neither spoke. The wind brushed through the tall grass, carrying the scent of pine and rain. He reached out, took her hand and held it tight. The world around them felt still, as if waiting to begin again. They traveled slowly for several days, moving through open plains and rocky hills. Along the way they met a few kind souls, traders, settlers, even a preacher who shared bread and coffee by his campfire. No one asked too many questions. The widow told them she was a mother traveling west with her family, and that was all anyone needed to hear. When they finally reached the valley he had spoken of, it was just as he described: wide meadows, a clear stream running between two hills, and wildflowers blooming where the earth had never been disturbed. The boys ran ahead, laughing and splashing in the water. The widow stood beside the Apache, her heart full. "It's beautiful," she said. He nodded slowly. "It's home." They built a small cabin together using wood from fallen pines. It took weeks, but they worked side by side, the boys helping where they could. At night, they sat by the fire sharing stories, the widow telling tales from her childhood back east, and the Apache speaking softly of his people and the stars that guided them. The loneliness that had once haunted them both began to fade. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned golden, he walked down to the creek where she was washing clothes. He stopped beside her, his reflection shimmering on the water. "When I first saw you," he said quietly, "I thought you were another storm passing through. But you stayed." She looked up, smiling faintly. "Maybe I was the calm after yours." He laughed softly, a sound rare and warm. Then his voice grew gentle. "You've given my sons hope again. You've given me peace I never thought I'd feel." She placed her hand over his. "And you gave me something to believe in again. After everything I lost, I thought my heart had died, but it didn't. It was just waiting for you." The wind stirred the tall grass, the sound soft as a prayer. Above them, the sky burned with the colors of evening: amber, rose, and gold. The boys' laughter echoed from the distance, the sound full of life. In that moment, the past no longer had power over them. The land that once divided now joined them. Two souls from different worlds bound by courage, loss, and love that had survived the storm. As the light faded, the widow rested her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her gently. For the first time in years, the valley was quiet, not with emptiness, but with peace. And when the night came, the stars rose above their new home, shining bright and endless, as if to remind them that even after the fiercest storms, there was always something worth holding on to.